Hi. For day 2, we're going to take a look at angles. And basically all we're going to do in this lesson is just review things that you probably have seen before at some point. When we talk about angles, we'll talk about things like acute angles or right angles, that kind of thing, and it's very helpful if you know exactly what that means. So really today we're going to talk a lot about vocabulary. On your paper, in your packet, you probably want to have out that sheet in your packet where it says vocabulary that you need to know. If you have that out when we go through the definitions, then you can pretty much just get them in there as you watch the video. Alright, so if we take a look at the second page, it asks us basically to define an acute angle, and then we're going to draw a picture. So for an acute angle, it's an angle less than 90 degrees. Now, to draw a picture, what we're going to do is we're actually going to go to points and lines, and we'll choose ray. And we're going to draw a ray that goes in one direction, go back to the end point, draw a ray that goes in another direction. And if you imagine 90 degrees, we want to go a little bit less than that, and drop the other side. Then hit escape, and the next thing we're going to do is measure that angle to make sure it's less than 90. So go to measurement, go to angle, and then click on the 3 points, one on one side of the angle, one at the vertex, one on the other side, and hopefully you get an angle that's less than 90 degrees. Now, just to kind of make sure that you understand this whole idea, if I grab that point and move it, if I grab the ray and move it, 90 degrees is right around there, a little bit bigger, but you get the idea. That's 90 degrees. So anything smaller than that is going to move this ray closer to the other ray. And anything bigger than 90 degrees is going to move it closer to becoming a straight line. Okay, 180 degrees is a straight line. Alright, so again, let's move it so that it's acute, and then we'll go to the next page. A right angle is always going to be 90 degrees. It's not less than, it's not more than, it's not even 90.2. It has to be exactly 90 degrees. So again, down here we're going to start off with a ray. And then to make sure that I have 90 degrees, I'm actually going to construct something perpendicular to that ray, and I want it to go through that point. So right now what I have here is a 90 degree angle. What I'm going to do is go to points and lines, and choose a ray that goes from this point and follows that perpendicular line. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is hide that little part that's kind of sticking down at the bottom so that it actually looks like an angle. So I'm going to go to hide show, and I'm going to click on that line and then hit enter. Oops, let's try that again. Go to actions, hide show, click on the line. Notice it kind of gets grayed out, and then when you hit escape, that's gone. So it looks more like a 90 degree angle, and then we'll measure it just to make sure. So click on 3 points, and it tells us that we have a 90 degree angle. Alright, on the next page, an obtuse angle is an angle that measures more than 90 degrees, but less than 180 degrees. Alright, so again, let's start to build an angle. We'll put a ray on our page. So start with one ray, then we'll put another ray, and we want to move the second ray so that it's more than 90. So if 90 is here, we want to go more than 90, but we want to go less than 180. So once you get a straight line, you want to go a little bit less than that. So right around there looks good. And then we'll measure it to make sure. Measure the angle. Again, click on 3 points. And you should have an angle that's more than 90, but less than 180. Okay, adjacent angles are angles that are next to each other. And one thing to make sure that you keep in mind is that they must, can't type today, must share a common side. So, if you have angles that are next to each other, they have to have a side in common. So I'm going to start off with one angle. I'll go back to points and lines. start off with one angle, and then off of one of my sides I'm going to put another angle. So right here I have an angle, and next to it I have a second angle, and they have a side in common. They have this side right here in common. So those are adjacent angles. There's really nothing special about them. They don't add up to 90 degrees, they don't add up to 180 degrees, they're not always the same size. The only thing that is true about adjacent angles is that they're touching, they're next to each other. Alright, vertical angles are angles across from each other that are the same size. Now normally you will get vertical angles when you have two lines that intersect. So on our screen, let's go ahead and put two lines, one that goes in one direction and the other one that crosses it. Now, for vertical angles, right now I have two pairs of vertical angles. I have the pair up here, so if you look where my cursor is, I have this angle and the one right below it. Those are vertical angles. And I have the other pair of angles that are across from each other. So one right here and across from that one. So what I want to do is measure a pair of vertical angles. So I'm going to start with the one on the top. Click on one point, go to the middle, click on the other side, and then do the same thing for the angle across from it. Now my measurements kind of jumped right on top of each other, so I'm just going to move them into the right angles, the correct angles. And it says that both of those angles are 122 degrees. So those are angles that are across from each other and they're the same size. The other pair, just so that you can see that I'm not making things up, because you never know, I'm going to measure the angle over here. That's 58.5 degrees, and the one across from it, also, if I move things, 58.5 degrees. So when you have lines that cross, the angles across from each other are vertical angles, and they're always going to be the same size. Again, if I move things, if I grab this line and I move it, again you see that the measurements change, but the angles across from each other are always the same no matter what I do. Alright, linear pair. That is a pair of angles that form a line. Okay, if you haven't seen it before, linear, anytime you see the word linear, it means line, and line is hidden in linear. So every time I see linear, I think about line. Okay, line is kind of the first part of that word. So every time you see linear, it's talking about a line. So a linear pair is a pair of angles that form a line. So down here, I'm going to start off with a line. And then off of that line, I'm going to add a ray so that I end up with two lines, or sorry, excuse me, two angles that form a straight line. Now, the angles absolutely have to be touching, and they absolutely have to form a line. Notice down here I can see that line where the two angles come together and form the line. They have to be touching, they have to be adjacent angles. Okay, on the next page, complementary angles and supplementary angles. Complementary angles add to 90 degrees. Supplementary angles add to 180 degrees. Now, the thing about complementary and supplementary angles is that they don't necessarily have to be touching. I'm not going to make you go through the pictures for these, but basically if you have two angles that are touching, they can add up to 90 degrees. Those are complementary, but they could be in completely different spaces and still add up to 90. Same thing with supplementary. You can have two angles that form 180 degrees, or you can have two angles that are apart and still add up to 180. Okay, angle bisector is a segment or a line or a ray, something that cuts an angle in half. So, if we draw an angle, and then we go to our menu, And in the construction menu, we have an angle bisector option. Now, we did this way back when we talked about constructions. We constructed an angle bisector. So really all I'm going to do is throw that on my picture. And you can see the angle bisector. I'm just going to make it a little bit longer here. And what happens is the angle bisector cuts the angle in half. What that means is that the two angles that are formed should be the same size. So I'm just going to measure them to make sure. Alright, so it looks like the first one I measured was 48.1 and the second one is 48.1. So again, they are equal. Congruent angles are angles that are the same size. So the angles up above, those two angles are congruent. Perpendicular. Perpendicular, whenever you see perpendicular, it means that things meet to form 90 degrees. Alright, so if we start off with a line, and then we go to our construction menu, we can construct something perpendicular to that line, and then just move it wherever you want it to go. What happens is that every single one of those angles around that intersection are 90 degrees. And we can quickly see by measuring. So I'm going to measure the angle on the top, and then the one down below, and then the ones on the other side. And I should have a whole bunch of 90s that kind of popped right on top of each other right there. Okay, so again, every angle, when you have perpendicular lines, every angle turns out to be 90 degrees. So that's pretty much it for today. Basic vocabulary. Make sure that you have them on your vocab sheet in your packet, and then tomorrow in class we'll do an exploration dealing with angles. So you'll discover a few more things with angles.